Way back on January 1st of this year, all movies from 1929 entered the public domain in the US, so I thought this would be a good time to cover the biggest shakeup that Hollywood has ever seen, the Talkie Revolution. The story goes that the 1927 movie The Jazz Singer was the first talkie in the history of film. That, at least, is what used to be said. As you might remember in my other video about myths and misconceptions about the 1920s, that milestone is up for debate. The real milestone of The Jazz Singer was far more specific. It was the first feature film with synchronized spoken dialogue. Kind of. I covered the specific details in that other video if you really want to know the nitty-gritty. The Talkie Revolution has often been summed up by saying that The Jazz Singer was released and it changed everything, the end. But this was not really true. The full transition to talkies was a much more gradual process. To provide the full context, we'll have to go further back. So now let's take a very brief look at the early history of the combining of sound and film before the 1920s. As far back as 1895, Thomas Edison had experimented with the idea and called it kinetophone. It basically involved attaching a cylinder phonograph with the already existing kinetoscope to provide an all-in-one experience. The public interest in the kinetophone was not very high, and Edison had to focus on reacting to the shift toward projection of motion pictures, and he more or less abandoned his project with synchronized sound. He revived the kinetophone in 1913, and it was received fairly well by the public, but only really as a novelty. There were some lesser-known ventures into synchronized sound after this. One of these was the photokinema, which was a sound-on-disc process used in the D.W. Griffith film Dream Street in 1921. But the novelty of sound was not enough to save this movie. Even though it was made by D.W. Griffith, the legendary filmmaker, it was a total flop. Other shorts were made with the photokinema process, but it quickly faded away. A more promising attempt was phonofilm. Lee DeForest was an inventor who had invented the audion tube, an important contribution to both the development of radio and television. By 1923, he was finally able to achieve synchronized sound and film, though had had some experimental successes as early as 1921. And the process he used went above and beyond. While others were still going the route of playing the film and sound on separate devices, DeForest was able to record the sound onto the film itself. He unveiled arguably the first truly synchronized sound film to the public on April 15, 1923, at the Rivoli Theater on Broadway in New York City. Pretty much all the phonofilm shorts at this time were less than 10 minutes, and mostly featured various entertainment acts like singers, musicians, and vaudeville performers. DeForest got into a dispute with Theodore Case, another inventor, who, along with Earl Sponable, had provided DeForest with an essential component, a sensitive photoelectric cell, that had been crucial to the success of the sound film experiments. And Case was angry that DeForest often didn't give him credit. When giving interviews, DeForest sometimes gave credit for Case's important contributions, and sometimes he didn't. Other times, he even took credit for Case's inventions. He was also unreliable about giving Case the money he was entitled to. After Case terminated their business relationship in December 1925, DeForest continued on with phonofilm. Even though DeForest toured the US showing the relatively functional new invention, it never really caught on. By 1926, his company was bankrupt. And there are a few reasons for this failure. First, his dispute with Case hurt the development of the process, and DeForest rubbed other people the wrong way as well. Phonofilm shorts also had varying sound quality. Sometimes it was pretty good, other times not so good. DeForest also always had a problem raising capital. Movie studios were not interested. They either saw it as nothing more than a novelty or were placing their bets on other systems with bigger corporations behind them. Another reason is that Phonofilm rarely featured Hollywood actors and actresses. When people watched movies, those were the people they generally wanted to see. DeForest was able to feature Thomas Meighan and Gloria Swanson in a Phonofilm short, but it was shown at a private event, and didn't get the exposure necessary to win over the public and get investors. The next sound film process was the one that finally made a dramatic breakthrough in its presentation to the public. In 1925, Warner Brothers teamed up with Western Electric's Bell Laboratories to pursue sound film with Vitaphone. If you recall, Phonofilm was a sound-on-film process, meaning that the sound was put on the film strip itself. It was an all-in-one package. Vitaphone was a sound-on-disc process, meaning that the sound was put onto a large phonograph disc to be played separately but simultaneously with the film. The pursuit of sound film at Warner Brothers had mainly been the initiative of Sam Warner. He was the idea man. He was able to win over his brother Harry, then the other brothers, to his cause, though Harry believed people would only want to hear musical performances rather than talking pictures. Warner Brothers publicly unveiled Vitaphone at the premiere of the movie Don Juan on August 6, 1926, in New York City, along with some Vitaphone shorts to be played before it. The sound in Don Juan consisted of a full musical score, as well as some sound effects, but no talking. The shorts contained musical performances, as well as a short spoken introduction by Will Hayes. The premiere of Don Juan really started the transitional era of movies with sound. To differentiate between movies like this and talkies, I'll call them sound films, which was a common thing to call them back then. The premiere of Don Juan and the shorts in New York was successful, but why was this different from the reception that Phonofilm got? First of all, Vitaphone's sound quality was better. Not perfect, but better. It also had better microphones, amplification, and loudspeakers at its disposal, all made by a cutting-edge company. In a slightly ironic twist, Western Electric achieved better amplification with the help of Lee DeForest's Audion tube, which it had bought back in 1913. Another reason Vitaphone succeeded is because Don Juan featured a famous actor, both in movies and on the stage, John Barrymore. And it was also a full-length movie with a story, complete with action and love scenes. The soundtrack was performed by the New York Philharmonic. And although the sound equipment couldn't always handle the sound of the 107-piece orchestra, people still appreciated this big step. It's also important to note that practically all movie theaters at this time were not equipped for sound, so this full sound version of Don Juan really was a novelty. Warner Brothers came out with their second sound film 2.5 months later. The Better Role, starring Sid Chaplin, was another financial success. It's also notable for being the first feature film to contain an audible spoken word, which was coffee. 1926 also saw the release of a number of Vitaphone shorts. These were sometimes more popular than the features they were presented with. Most of these were musical performances, both popular and classical performers, like Elsie Janis, Giovanni Martinelli, Anna Case, and Al Jolson. Yes, even the man largely credited with starting the talkie revolution had already made a Vitaphone short the year before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1927, Warner Brothers released a few more sound films, like When a Man Loves, Old San Francisco, and The First Auto. But these didn't really attract as much attention as you might think, which is why they're often forgotten today. At the same time, the Fox Film Corporation had gotten hold of a sound process of its own, which was superior to Vitaphone in some ways. Like DeForest's phonofilm process, it recorded the sound onto the film itself, making a perfect synchronization without the need to synchronize sound and picture separately. This process was called Movietone, and it was developed by none other than Theodore Case, the man who had broken with DeForest over phonofilm. William Fox, sensing the immense business possibilities for sound film, bought Case's system. On January 21, 1927, Fox debuted Movietone to the public with a sound re-release of the previous smash hit What Price Glory, which had first been released the year before. Just like with Don Juan, sound shorts were included in the package. Overall, Fox's unveiling was more low-key than Warner Brothers. Fox also made one especially smart move. Only a day after Charles Lindbergh made his famous flight from New York to Paris, it released a sound newsreel of the famous event. Fox already had a series of silent newsreels, and with the success of this sound one covering the biggest story of the decade, it was only natural that sound newsreels would quickly be put into production. Lee DeForest also made a sound newsreel of Lindbergh, but lacked a way to widely distribute it, so it was buried. Fox's newsreel, meanwhile, became famous and made the rounds. Because Movietone was far more practical for on-location filming than Vitaphone, newsreels were a significant advantage for Fox, and so it pushed them hard. It also helped that their main rival in newsreels, Pathé, was not yet in the sound business. Movietone was undeniably superior to Vitaphone in terms of distribution. The Vitaphone discs not only took up a lot more space when transported, but each film also required an entire set of discs, and sometimes they were mislabeled, incomplete, or damaged. Not to mention that they wore out quickly and had to be replaced often. Movietone just required the film reels and didn't have as much of these problems. And then, of course, during the actual exhibition of the film, Vitaphone discs had to be changed quickly by the projectionist multiple times during the course of the movie, while Movietone films were just run more or less normally. There was also a higher chance with Vitaphone that a careless projectionist would make a mistake, like, for example, playing the wrong disc. However, the sound quality of Vitaphone, at least at its best, was arguably superior to Movietone. And at this time, if everything went right with the exhibition of Vitaphone, the sound quality was what would have impressed an audience the most. But for moviegoers, the sound quality for either system varied depending on the theater, because they hadn't yet been specifically designed and optimized for sound films. Fox followed up its debut of Movietone by re-releasing another recent smash hit, Seventh Heaven, with an added soundtrack and sound effects. But its next sound release was an even bigger move. Fox had recently acquired the artistic German director F.W. Murnau. His first film with Fox was arguably his masterpiece. Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans was not a smash hit at the box office, but it wasn't really expected to be. But Fox played to the critics with this one. With so many innovations in cinematography and its artistic presentation, it's now considered to be one of the best silent films ever made. Even though it had synchronized sound, it was shot silent and used only silent film techniques in the actual filming. And the achievement of Sunrise did not go unrecognized at the time. Later, at the first Academy Awards in 1929, it won in the Best Unique and Artistic Picture category. It also proved that sound could be utilized to enhance film as an art form, and wasn't just a cheap novelty. Though it was still a bit early for this influence to be really noticed by the public. In 1927, sound films were mostly seen as a replacement for live musicians in movie theaters, and weren't yet seen as something that would completely upend the entire industry. The original intention, at least among the movie studios, was to bring the sounds of big professional orchestras to the average Joe living far away from them. While the bigger theaters had a large collection of great musicians, the smaller local theaters could only have a small number of accompanists, so they were much more limited in what they could do. And not every local musical accompanist was good. It was thought that sound films would solve both of these problems, if they caught on, with this idea of canned music. At this point, the two main studios actively pursuing the development of sound films were Warner Brothers and Fox, both of which were kind of second-tier studios compared to the big dogs like Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount. But those studios had grown a bit complacent and had let their guard down. Both Warner Brothers and Fox took a big risk in pursuing sound films, because there was no guarantee that the public would be interested in them in the long term. After all, sound films had already failed multiple times before. But this time, their gamble would pay off. Don Juan had made quite a splash as the first real sound film, but a bigger triumph came on October 6, 1927, with the premiere of the Warner Brothers movie The Jazz Singer in New York, again using the Vitaphone process. And as a side note, you might be wondering why Don Juan and The Jazz Singer premiered in New York rather than the film capital, Hollywood. This was because Warner Brothers had bought the struggling Vitagraph studio in New York, and later used it to make Vitaphone shorts and movies. This also explains why John Barrymore and Al Jolson featured in the two movies. Like most of the big stage performers, they had made their fame in New York, and were especially famous and popular there. As the premiere of The Jazz Singer approached, Warner Brothers was nervous, because if there was a technical problem with Vitaphone, they would probably be laughed at, or at least wouldn't be taken seriously. But the brothers breathed a sigh of relief when nothing went wrong. Well, except Sam Warner, who unfortunately died the day before the premiere from an infection in his brain. So, what was the importance of this movie specifically? How was The Jazz Singer different from all the others before it? Well, not as much as you may think. But like I said at the beginning of the video, it was the first feature-length movie to have synchronized spoken dialogue, though there were only sequences of spoken dialogue. But there's actually barely any of this in the movie. Only about 2 minutes of spoken dialogue is featured, and only 15% of the movie contains songs. Roughly halfway through the movie, just before breaking into a musical number, the star of the film, Al Jolson, says,
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you, you ain't heard nothing.
And here is really when the Talkie revolution kicked off, at least symbolically. Jolson was really the perfect man for the job. He was already famous, his voice was unique and beloved, and his expressive performance style was exactly what was needed to make a strong impression with sound films. He was entertaining to watch and hear, so being able to experience both in a movie theater was a treat. Warner Brothers really needed to make money with The Jazz Singer. If they didn't, they faced possible bankruptcy. Their financial investment in sound films was massive. And in fact, at this point, it still wasn't certain that sound films would go past the novelty phase. While The Jazz Singer did well at the box office and was one of the top-grossing movies of 1927, it still fell far short of previous smash hit silent films such as Ben-Hur, The Freshman, The Gold Rush, and The Kid, among others. One reason for this was that the number of theaters able to play sound films hadn't changed much since Don Juan. a lot of extra equipment, like loudspeakers, had to be installed at a hefty price. And without the promise of sound at their theater, some people probably passed up the silent version because they weren't interested in the story. If a theater was owned or affiliated with one of the studios pushing sound films, it was generally obligated to have it equipped. But Warner Brothers and Fox didn't have as many theater holdings as the bigger studios, but that would soon change. And besides, studio-affiliated theaters in general only accounted for about 15% of all movie theaters at the time. Most independent theater owners wanted to see how sound would play out before they invested an obscene amount of money into the installations. When The Jazz Singer premiered, only about a dozen theaters in the entire world could actually show the sound version. So a big portion of its grosses actually came from the silent version. Nonetheless, even with this handicap, The Jazz Singer made more than enough money to give Warner Brothers a big boost. On a budget of $422,000, it made $2.6 million. The Jazz Singer is really one part of the whole in the story of Hollywood's transition to sound. But after a string of somewhat underperforming sound movies earlier that year, this was an important step. But it would be quite a while before the next part Talkie was released. A full 5 months later, Warner Brothers premiered the second part Talkie, Tenderloin, on March 14, 1928. Then came other part Talkies like Glorious Betsy and The Lion and the Mouse. These, and others around the same time, saw a much better average return on investment than the ones between Don Juan and The Jazz Singer. Also in 1928, Warner Brothers would make history again by releasing the first all-talking movie, The Lights of New York. It was a historic achievement, though the critical reviews were understandably negative. Many critics felt that the focus on the all-talking novelty had completely distracted attention from the actual story, which many found disappointing to say the least. A reviewer in Harrison's reports called it a piece of junk. Motion Picture Magazine put it more gently, saying that it displayed simply the crudeness of pioneer work. But The Lights of New York proved that making a bad movie into a talkie could save it financially, though that was something that could not be repeated too many times. What's more important is that it showed how much interest there was in talkies. While it made less money than The Jazz Singer, its return on investment was incredible. On a budget of only $23,000, it made over $1.2 million. Just like with the first part talkie, there was a considerable gap between the first and second full talkies. The Lights of New York was released on July 8, 1928, and the second one, The Terror, also from Warner Brothers, premiered on September 6th. But this time, the intervening period consisted of both sound films and part talkies, with some of the last silent films also making the rounds. And later that month came one of the biggest hits of the entire decade, The Singing Fool. This was Al Jolson's follow-up to The Jazz Singer, and it blew that movie out of the water in terms of box office gross, reaching well over double the returns on a slightly reduced budget. If The Jazz Singer can be credited with causing the spark of the talkie revolution, then The Singing Fool was the resulting fire. In this period of sound films, part talkies, and full talkies, all of the big studios were now engaged in converting to sound. Many of them took pre-existing silent movies and added sound to them. Sometimes it was just a soundtrack, but other times they added in entirely new sequences of dialogue. Part talkies were an awkward in-between, often created when a silent film had been completely or mostly filmed already, but needed to be kept up to date to score better at the box office. This was when synchronized dialogue sequences were added in after the fact, and these movies have been called goat glands. You can see an example of one of these in my video about the 1928 movie Noah's Ark. Fox took longer to make the transition from sound films to talkies, only releasing its first part talkie in September 1928, called Mother Knows Best. It released its first full talkie in Old Arizona a few months later in December. But again, Fox made an important contribution. In Old Arizona was the first talkie filmed outdoors. By the time Fox made its first full talkie, other studios had begun to hop on the bandwagon. Universal released its first, The Melody of Love, in October 1928. It had rented Fox's Movietone process, and had to rush the movie through production to get it done before the rental period was up. Paramount then released its first full talkie, Interference, the next month. As I briefly mentioned before, the studios also released silent versions of talkies. This was because the vast majority of theaters had still not been wired for sound. At the beginning of 1928, only 157 theaters out of a total of around 20,000 were wired for sound. But the numbers were starting to pick up by the end of the year, with 850 being wired for sound by early December. Seeing that talkies probably weren't going away anytime soon, the big studios scrambled to build sound stages for talkie production. Paramount, MGM, First National, Universal, and the Producers Distribution Corporation had all previously agreed to use the same sound system should they need to. That time had come, and they went with Western Electric's system. Western Electric also only leased their equipment, they didn't sell it. This allowed them to retain ownership while they raked in the money. Western Electric provided the lion's share of sound systems for movies, with their only competitor being RCA, who had unveiled their own system in April 1928. By 1929, Warner Brothers and Fox were rich in capital, and were using it for acquisitions. In September 1928, Warner Brothers bought a majority share in First National, with Fox buying a significant minority share. Later, in November 1929, Fox sold its shares to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers and Fox also bought up theater chains, which they could use to prioritize their movies and keep out competitors. Ironically, some of the best Hollywood silent films were released in these last 2 years before full talkies took over everything. And we can also include transitional sound films, since they still mostly relied on silent filmmaking methods. Movies like Wings, The King of Kings, Street Angel, The Circus, Seventh Heaven, Sunrise, Steamboat Bill Jr., The Cameraman, The Crowd, The Wind, Show People, and Speedy were all released between 1927 and 1928. To demonstrate just how fast the transition to talkies was, here's an example. Photoplay magazine, the top movie magazine of the 1920s, began listing sound films in its September 1928 issue, where only 4 films were listed. By the January 1930 issue, there was absolutely no mention of silent films in the listings anymore. With the zenith of the silent film art form happening at the same time as the introduction of talkies, there was talk of them coexisting. By the end of 1928, it was clear that talkies weren't going away, but some in the industry thought that certain types of movies were better suited to silence, and some better suited to talkies. But as we know, that's not how it turned out in the end. Early talkies had quite a few limitations. The actors had to speak loudly and enunciate very clearly, sometimes unnaturally so, in order for the sound to be recorded well enough. There was also less opportunity for movement, since the sound equipment was heavy and bulky, and thus not very mobile. This led to stiff, uninspiring dialogue scenes between characters.
Hasn't come to level with this gal. Oh, he ain't. He plays them all. He's serious this time. This morning he asked me if I knew anything about buying furniture on the installment plan.
Cinematography especially had to basically start over from scratch. cameras were virtually immobile at first. Cameramen for the first talkies were confined to a booth because the noise of the camera would be picked up by the microphones. These booths got very, very hot and uncomfortable. Only slowly did the cameras begin to move again. The camera booths could be placed on wheels and moved around a bit, and there were other small innovations that helped eliminate the mobility problem. And with the camera starting to move again, microphones also began to move. It seems that most of the major studios independently devised ways of getting away from the stiff, unmoving conversations between characters with different variations of a boom mic. The sound man became the most important person on the studio lot. Every take had to be approved by him in order to proceed further with filming. Suddenly, actors and directors who were used to having things their way were supplanted in authority. Everyone was aware that the sound man now had the power to make or break careers. The popularity of talkies effectively ended some careers, or convinced some to quit. Of course, there was the issue of voices, the most commonly cited examples being lisping or raspy voices. But more often, the actor's real voice just didn't fit with people's conception of what it should sound like. And if audiences didn't hear the same kind of voice that they had heard in their head, they were often disappointed. This was perhaps more detrimental to the careers of silent actors than just their voice quality. There was also the problem of accents. In the silent era, if an actor had an accent, it didn't really matter. But now, with talkies and the imperfect sound recording quality, heavy accents might be unintelligible to the audience. And there were quite a few very successful European actors in Hollywood, like Pola Negri, Greta Garbo, Emil Jannings, and Vilma Benke, whose careers, in Hollywood at least, were now on the line. Talkies especially affected film comedians, who in the silent era mostly specialized in physical comedy. Harold Lloyd managed to hang on to his film career for a bit, though he was never again as famous as he was in the 20s. But I would argue that this was also due to his glasses character being so quintessentially 1920s. Lloyd's character was associated with an optimistic, go-getter attitude, a young man who gets ahead in life through determination and a bit of luck. With the Depression, this character didn't quite fit with society anymore. This kind of thing also affected actresses who specialized in flapper roles. Then there was Buster Keaton. A big reason for his decline was a contract with MGM that took away most of his creative control. But it's not difficult to see that his style wasn't really a good fit for talkies, since he had relied on very elaborate physical stunts. And of course, there was the very stubborn Charlie Chaplin, who just kept on making movies in the silent film style, almost as if nothing had changed, though he was still able to remain popular. He only made his first real talkie in 1940, having stuck to silent film techniques with 2 movies in the 1930s. But as with many things, Chaplin was the exception. There were a lot of other factors that led to career declines of silent actors. Take, for example, the acting style. A silent movie used primarily images, facial expressions, and gestures. In a talkie, there was more to think about during a scene, and an actor had to learn how to act with their voice, a skill that wasn't necessary before. Some actors' voices were fine, they just couldn't use them properly. This is why early talkies often poached from vaudeville and the stage. These actors were already used to acting with their voices, so the transition would most likely be smoother for them. After all, many early talkies were much more similar to stage plays than the more mobile and stylized silents. And some actors simply didn't want to do talkies. For a serious silent movie actor, early talkies were often stilted, boring, and felt unnatural. Not to mention that their whole technique when doing a scene was now completely different. In a 1920s silent movie, Actors would usually be coached through a scene by the director. And to get actors into a certain mood for a scene, they often utilized live music. But neither of those things could be done in talkies for obvious reasons. For some actors who had been doing it this way for years, it was just too much of a bother. Many had made a lot of money doing silent films, and now they had the option of retiring. Now I just want to give some specific examples of actors whose careers suffered in the talkie era for reasons other than just having a bad voice. John Gilbert has been an often repeated example. It was kind of a perfect storm of problems. First of all, his voice didn't really match the audience's expectations. And he also didn't always act well with his voice, though the actual quality of his voice was fine. Despite a popular myth that it was shrill, there wasn't anything wrong with it in itself. But the way he said things was often seen as funny to audiences when it shouldn't have been. Gilbert's first talkie, His Glorious Night, was kind of a mess. The script was over the top and just bad. And Gilbert also had a falling out with his studio boss, Louis B. Mayer, which didn't make it any easier to keep his job. He was marked as a financial liability and wasn't given good parts. MGM just had him meet his contractual obligations and got rid of him when his contract was up. Gilbert had once been at the top of the Hollywood star system, and his fall was one of the hardest and most tragic. He was already an alcoholic, and that, coupled with depression over his failed career, would kill him in 1936. Another commonly cited victim of talkies was Clara Bow. She actually did make the transition successfully, but she was, however, horrified when she heard her own voice for the first time in a voice test. The real reason for her career decline is that she just hated doing talkies and was overly nervous when filming for them. Like Colleen Moore and Joan Crawford, Bow was known for playing flappers, a character type that disappeared in the Depression era. She also began to have issues with her mental health and retired in 1933. Douglas Fairbanks, made famous for his swashbuckling roles in action-adventure movies, didn't perform well in talkies. One of the main problems was just the fact that he was getting older. He was entering his late 40s when talkies became mainstream, and the action scenes were physically demanding, especially for a chain smoker like Fairbanks. And he wasn't too keen on having to change his acting style for talkies anyway. Fairbanks's wife, the equally, if not more famous Mary Pickford, was in a somewhat similar situation. She had been typecast as an innocent little girl, but playing a little girl when you're in your mid-30s is awkward to say the least, and she wanted to do other roles. She had already tried changing up her parts before with Dorothy Vernon of Haddon Hall in 1924, and it had not gone well. The problem was that she had been playing the same kind of childish characters, more or less, for 2 decades, and that's what she was known for. While there was nothing especially bad about her performances as adult characters, and her first talkie had been praised, her fans just didn't take to her new roles in the long run. The good returns for her first talkie, Coquette, could have just been from the novelty of hearing her speak. Despite her illustrious movie career over the years, she was no longer a box office draw. Lillian Gish was in a similar boat, since she had also portrayed ingenue characters, which had become very passé by the time talkies took over. Instead, she went back to the theater. She did eventually make some talkies, but was only in 2 movies in the 1930s. Her sister, Dorothy Gish, had the same desire to return to the stage, and she did too. She only did 1 talkie in 1930 during this early transitional period, not to return to the screen for over a decade. Constance and Norma Talmadge were also relics from the past. Constance immediately retired when talkies came around. Norma tried, but after doing some not very well-made movies, she retired too, not very interested in making movies anymore. Similarly, Florence Vidor hated the new process for making talkies, so she retired from movies for good. Those were just a few examples, but I hope I made my point that there were a lot more problems in the transition to talkies than just a bad-sounding voice. With sound came a rapid development in the industry, something some actors and actresses just couldn't keep up with or refused to participate in. The situation was pretty similar for directors. While they didn't have to worry about their image or voice like the actors, they also had to deal with the immense changes in the filmmaking process. Many of them couldn't cut it. Directors like Fred Niblo, Marshall Nealon, Rex Ingram, James Cruz, Herbert Brennan, and Clarence Badger all suffered career declines in the early talkie era. The more artistic directors had spent years developing a visual style, and talkies pretty much reset that. Stylistic visuals were all fine and good if they could be done, but it was not always possible with the more static nature of early talkies. What is talked about far less is how talkies also jump-started careers. For example, Ronald Colman, Conrad Nagel, and William Powell had been fairly successful in silence, but they possessed excellent voices that were picked up perfectly by microphones. Another person made into a star due to talkies was Edward G. Robinson. It's hard to imagine him in his iconic gangster roles without his distinctive voice. Okay, now let's move on to a short but very hard-pushed trend. After the success of The Jazz Singer in 1927 and the massive success of The Singing Fool in 1928, the year 1929 saw a boom in movie musicals. This was something that was, for obvious reasons, impossible to do in the same way in silent films. Movie audiences were being spoiled with novelties at this time. When sound films came around, they didn't want silence anymore. And when talkies came around, they didn't want sound films anymore. And by 1929, actors simply talking about anything wasn't a novelty anymore, and they wanted something new again. Broadway shows and other stage shows were one of the biggest competitors to the film industry. But now, movies could do almost anything stage shows could do, and more. Movie musicals could scrap the stiff conversations of early talkies and opt instead for something fun and energetic. If you take a quick look at the top-grossing movies of 1929, you'll find that practically all of them are musicals. And this sudden trend of musicals also hurt the careers of some actors, because if they couldn't sing or dance, then they weren't in demand for the biggest movies of 1929. Or, at the very least, they were vulnerable to being overshadowed by performers who could sing or dance. And while this musical trend was a short-lived one, in the fast-moving atmosphere of the early talkie period, 1 year away from the spotlight, and you could be forgotten very quickly. Others, like Bessie Love, flourished in these musicals because she could already sing and dance, and could even play the ukulele. A lot of the early movies that were part of this trend were in black and white, but the big film studios decided to double down on another novelty: color. A number of silents had contained select scenes in color. Full color films had also been made before, but only in rare instances. With the advent of movie musicals, audiences could be further dazzled with glorious color during dancing sequences, showing off the flair and vibrancy of the costumes that had been denied them for so long. With this double whammy of novelties, the public ate up these movies, as many movie theater owners hurried to fit their theaters with sound capabilities. Many of these 1929 musicals were objectively not great films, but that wasn't the point. They further solidified the dominance of talkies, and made it pretty clear that silent films from only a couple of years ago were old before their time. The coming of talkies also had some other important effects on the industry as well. One was the virtual disappearance, temporarily, of smaller studios in the US. Only the big studios could afford to make talkies, since the cost of the new sound equipment was very high in those early years. Cheap knockoff sound equipment did exist, but it was generally of poor quality. The public hunger for talkies was too great, and the small independent studios just couldn't compete. Talkies also affected small independent theaters. Movie studios owned most of the bigger theaters, and it was easier for them to convert to sound because they were financially supported by the studios. Smaller independent theaters could not rush into the new trend so quickly, which was okay for a while, since second, third, and fourth run theaters and lower tier theaters had always been behind and kept playing silent films for a bit longer. But the big movie studios demonstrated an even greater dominance in an industry that they had already controlled so effectively. The gap between their theaters and other theaters widened significantly. Even though movie studios had all but abandoned silent films by around mid-1929, only about 50% of theaters were wired for sound at that point. By 1931, it had only increased to 61%. On November 16, 1929, an oddity was released. It was an MGM film called The Kiss, starring Greta Garbo. MGM had been the last of the big studios to switch to sound, and at a time when virtually all Hollywood movies were full talkies or part talkies, this one wasn't. It had synchronized sound, but in terms of filmmaking, it was essentially a silent film. There was no spoken dialogue. Believe it or not, despite the circumstances, The Kiss actually performed pretty well. Reviews from critics were also positive. For many of them, who had spent the majority of their careers reviewing silence, this must have been a poignant moment, representing a quiet but respectful send-off to an art form that was very soon to be extinct. Only a very small number of movies were released in the early 1930s that were basically silent films, like Taboo and The Silent Enemy. Europe and especially Asia clung on to silent films for a bit longer than the US. The success of Charlie Chaplin's City Lights in 1931 sparked a debate about whether it could revive interest in making silent movies, but nothing really came of it. Silent film may have died in its purest form, but its influence can be seen everywhere. Some movies have directly taken inspiration, most obviously The Naked Island from 1960, Silent Movie from 1976, and The Artist from 2011. Pixar's WALL-E has no dialogue for a long stretch in the first section of the movie, relying more on visuals to tell a story and elicit an emotional response. More recently, the entire first season of the animated show Primal has no dialogue. Any movie or show that tells a story mainly through visuals can be seen as taking inspiration from silent film, whether consciously or unconsciously. So in that way, its influence will never completely die. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time, since I find this brief period in film history fascinating, and it had a massive amount of influence on the film industry as a whole, pretty much upending everything. I don't think anyone is still upset about talkies existing, though it is sad how silent movies got completely put out of existence, especially when they were getting really good. In a perfect world, we would have both talkies and silent films coexisting, but that's not how things usually work out. Just like what happened to radio dramas and comedies in the 1950s, the shiny new toy completely replaced the older one, reliable as it was. Well, in America at least. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.
All
All the old-time stars were seen but not heard. Now you hear them lisp every word ever since the movies learned to talk.